About a month ago, I had an exchange on Twitter with filmmaker Kevin Williams. Mr. Williams made a little-known documentary called Fear of a Black Republican. The title was a play on words of Public Enemy's rap album, Fear of a Black Planet. As I perused Mr. Williams' website, it was clear his intent was to help revamp the image of the modern Republican Party. As a black person, I'm always skeptical when a group of people who've made it publicly known that I'm the enemy come sauntering up to my house offering to help me. But I decided to put my apprehension aside and give Mr. Williams an opportunity to make his case. The website contains snippets from his film, but not a lot of information of what the Republicans should do about their black voter problem. Eventually, I did come across a link on his site to an article he wrote in the Washington Post about the Republican winter meeting of 2013. As I read the article, it was actually surprising. Surprising because here was finally a Republican who appeared to get it. At the end of the article, Mr. Williams makes a list of suggestions for how the GOP can address its black voter quagmire. At the top of the list, he puts the same thing that I myself would have said if I were advising the GOP, only I would have made it the second thing to do. He says, quote, reach out to the African American and urban voters already in the districts the GOP represents to get an idea of how bad things actually are. Listen, don't talk much. Know where ground zero is for real. In other words, he advises the Republican Party to do with its race problem what every accountant tells a person that has financial problems. Bring us your books so we can see your numbers, not your ego or opinions about the numbers, and we can assess how bad the situation really is. This was a good start. However, as a black person looking at it objectively, this was not where I would have begun, because it still hedges around the edges and doesn't address the 9,000-pound elephant in the room. Pardon the expression. As a matter of fact, Mr. Williams, over the course of 9 bullet points, never actually addresses the real issue either. And any substance abuse counselor will tell you, you can't fix your problem until you face your problem. 4 bullet points later, Mr. Williams suggests that the Republican Party should repeat its apology for the party's signature perennial campaign tactic, the Southern strategy. So even here, while it might seem Mr. Williams was actually going to tackle the issue, he never does. And so a sterling opportunity for the GOP to finally sit down and resolve its race problem goes up in smoke. You know what the Republican Party is like? It's like an old rock star who's surrounded by a bunch of groupies and yes men. Everyone sees he's killing himself with booze and drugs, but they won't tell him the truth in plain words for fear of offending him. And as a result, he's never allowed to get better. While Mr. Williams pretended to try to do this, eventually it became clear he isn't interested in doing this either. And so I will do for the Republican Party what no one, not the party's leadership, not its rank and file, not its spokesman on the radio, not Kevin Williams, or anyone else we can see is willing to do. Tell the GOP why they can't get black support. The Republican Party does not get black support because the Republican Party is the party of bigots. Not the party of old people or people out of step with the modern era. These are misleading slick words meant to disguise the truth. The Republican Party is a hate group masquerading as a political organization. And they are so steaming and frothing with racial hatred that they can't even contain it long enough to win an election cycle. Now, the killing thing about this is that most of the Republicans who heard me say I was going to tell them what the problem was already knew what I was going to say. In fact, they've known it since 1968, and this is the game the Republicans play with themselves. Oh, I know, they think they're playing it with the general public, but poll after poll reveals that they aren't fooling anyone. They believe if they just refuse to say what everyone else in the room is thinking, then no one else will notice it. In psychology, this is called denial. That old drunk rock star has walked into the room with no pants on and figures no one will notice if he just doesn't say he's not wearing any. Now, in all fairness, I should say that the Republican Party is composed of 2 wings, racists and fundamentalists. The racists are the majority and run for elected office the most. The fundamentalists are the people who talk about balancing the budget and keeping the Christ in Christmas. The latter group exists in the Republican Party, and they are not primarily concerned about race. However, these people are almost statistically insignificant. They do not hold the levers of power in the party. What they do accomplish is they provide cover for the bigot wing of the party, who can just tell people, I'm not one of those racist Republicans, I'm with the Tea Party. So now everyone is walking around saying they don't care about race, only about budgets. And meanwhile, the talk of racial hatred continues behind closed doors and open mics. The problem with pretending the modern GOP doesn't have a race problem is that it denies a basic fundamental fact of the Republican Party. It is the party of white people, and when it comes to leadership, it is the party of white males. If you're a white male who wants a party of practically all white males, where all the key decisions are made by white males and no non-white males have any authority, then the GOP is made to order for you. To deny this is to deny mathematics. The party of Lincoln has been dead for half a century. What we now have is the party of Nixon and Goldwater. Non-whites have never been represented or had a say in this Republican Party. Briefly, let's debunk this party of Lincoln garbage. The Republicans think if they repeat a lie long enough, people will accept it as truth. So to combat their racism problem, they try a new spin on I have black friends. They say, we're the party of Lincoln, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation. So that denial problem Republicans have resurfaces again. Republicans like to believe the 1960s just didn't happen. Remember that Southern strategy I mentioned earlier? Well, all the Southern states used to be Democratic strongholds. Luminaries like Strom Thurmond and George Wallace had a stranglehold on power, and their stance on black people was very clear.
There's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches.
But after Presidents Kennedy and Johnson passed civil rights legislation, there was a mass defection from the Democratic Party. All those old hate mongers and so-called Dixiecrats abandoned the Democratic Party and crossed over to the Republicans. What this means is that most of the racists left the Democratic Party and took over the Republican Party. The party of Abraham Lincoln was now the party of Lincoln Rockwell. Republicans like to make believe that no one knows all the racists crossed over to their party, and from there the Southern strategy was born. And it's this constant attempt to insult the intelligence of the public that has now come back to rip them to shreds. Because you see, when you're a majority of the population, you really can turn your make-believe into everyone else's reality. You can do it with religion, school, and politics. And that's exactly what the Republicans did. There has never been a black outreach platform in the Republican Party. Only one Republican ever did try it, Jack Kemp, and he was summarily ignored by his entire party. In the 1990s, only one black man in America dared to identify himself as a Republican, Colin Powell. The less racist wing of the party even wanted to run him for president, but Powell eventually declined, stating that his party's racism was the key factor in his decision. I had mentioned the GOP's problems and suggested to Mr. Williams on Twitter what the deficiencies of his bullet points to the GOP were. And not surprisingly, the conciliatory tones immediately dropped once I made mention of the party's racism problem. Mr. Williams tried a tired polemic of trying to defend the GOP's racism by deflecting attention onto the Democrats. The problem with that argument isn't just that it's plain incorrect. The problem is that even if the Democrats are the worst racists this side of Al Jolson, that only gives us reasons to not vote for them. It still doesn't give us any reason to vote for you. When a child gets caught stealing, he tries to implicate other children to divert attention from his own offense. And to see in the year 2013 that grown men and women in the Republican Party are using the Billy the Schoolboy tactics should be downright depressing for the GOP. When a football team or a school or a company has a problem, they bring in new management. And what is the first thing new management does? They figure out what the biggest problem is, and they change the culture of the team or the company to attack that problem. The GOP's biggest problem is racism. And even if you're a GOP member so in denial that you don't want to believe that's the truth, you need to accept that that is the truth of why black people don't vote for you. So what do? Well, isn't it interesting how the GOP always fancies themselves these big problem solvers? Rudy Giuliani came into New York saying how he would solve the crime problem. What was his strategy? Instituting several zero-tolerance policies. No loitering, no jaywalking, no black males unaccompanied by a white person. He had several things the police absolutely wouldn't tolerate. This is what you do when you want to turn an organization around. You tell them the things that have sabotaged your success won't be tolerated any longer. If the GOP were serious about eradicating their racism problem, they would institute the same zero tolerance for racists in the party that they do for unarmed black males on the streets. But interestingly enough, the party of zero tolerance has unlimited tolerance for bigots. Now, I'm not talking about self-identified Republicans who host a radio show. I'm talking about real Republicans, actual elected officials who can make laws. They were always right out of view, but the election of Barack Obama ripped the wheels off the loony wagon, and the professional haters could no longer contain themselves. Their new strategy had only one rule: just don't call black people a nigger outright. Any other code words would be tolerated. And so the party of Lincoln, Rockwell that is, set out using every code word and doublespeak for racism they could imagine. Apparently some of the members didn't get the memo. Just this year in Kansas, Saline County Commissioner Jim Giles said that when the county hires an architect to design upgrades to the roads and bridges building, he wants to make sure they don't, quote, nigger rig it. When one of the citizens in attendance asked Giles what he said, another commission member, Randy Duncan, said, quote, he's like that congressman from Alaska. The congressman he's referring to is Republican Don Young of Alaska, who referred to Latinos who worked on his dad's farm as, quote, wetbacks. In 2008, Georgia Republican Representative Lynn Westmoreland referred to President Barack Obama as, quote, uppity, one half of the racist term uppity nigger, used after slavery to describe blacks who actually considered themselves no longer someone's property. When asked if he really meant what he just said, Westmoreland responded, quote, uppity, yeah. He said this 5 years ago in 2008. The Republicans are so non-racist that they just re-elected Westmoreland to his 5th term last year in 2012. And if you were foolish enough to believe that the problem is confined to raunchy county commissioners and rebel congressmen, look no further than the governor's mansions that the GOP holds across the country. If you were naive enough to think Georgia's Republican racist problem was just confined to Congressman Westmoreland, you need only check out Georgia Governor Nathan Deal. Governor Deal refuses to take a position on the state's ongoing segregated school proms. A true Renaissance man. He referred to little old ladies who might not have a birth certificate to get benefits as, quote, ghetto grandmothers. And just earlier this year, he took the surgical step of trying to fix the DeKalb County school system by firing 5 of the 6 black school board members. When the NAACP asked him why, he responded, find some good black people to run. In Virginia, Governor Bob McDonnell refused to recognize slavery during his Confederate History Month proclamation in 2010. And this brings us back to the racism problem of the GOP. They think that using code words like history and heritage will somehow fool people into not seeing the racism behind it. Have you ever noticed how practically every Republican supports the Confederate flag? Weren't the Confederates a bunch of seditionists and traitors? Yes, they were. The Confederate flag is the American swastika, and it only symbolized one part of American history: how white men were willing to kill and die for the right to murder and enslave black people. And everyone who holds any type of sentimentalism for the Confederacy knows that that's what they're defending. The Republican Party is the only party that has made defending the Confederate flag part of its stock in trade. Could you imagine a major political party in Germany who would still fly the swastika as part of elective office? Could you imagine a congressman suggesting a Benedict Arnold commemoration day? And yet the Republicans come to the children of the American slaves and expect us to overlook them heaping honors on insurrectionists? Have all these propagandists who peddle the phrase Party of Lincoln forgotten that it was the Confederacy that killed Abraham Lincoln and tried to murder other members of his cabinet in a failed coup to decapitate the United States government? No, these people aren't that dumb. They know full well what the Confederacy did. What they're hoping is that you don't know. Not just content to resurrect the Confederacy, the Republicans now want to altogether rewrite history and remove any mention of slavery or the founding fathers as white supremacist slaveholders from school textbooks. In a move reminiscent of how post-World War II Japan refused to teach their children about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Republican states of Texas and Tennessee now want to revise history with a new propaganda textbook. Ironically enough, it's a Tea Party group. You know, the people who claim to only be concerned about budgets and not social issues, who are spearheading the revisionist history movement in Tennessee. So much for Republicans who just care about budgets and not race. But the Republicans' racial debacle isn't just limited to the states. At the national level, the party's highest-ranking members have all solidified their racial credentials. Eric Cantor and John Boehner, the top-ranking House Republican leaders, have both refused to declare that anyone in the Republican Party who questions the citizenship of President Obama is not welcome in the Republican Party. Welcome to the birther's paradise. Former House Speaker and 2012 Republican presidential candidate Newt Gingrich went so far as to question not only President Barack Obama's citizenship, but his Americanness. Gingrich stated that Obama somehow harbored a Kenyan, quote, anti-colonialist worldview. First off, Kenya is a sovereign state that wanted independence from British colonialism the same way another country wanted freedom from British colonialism. You may have heard of the other country that still harbors an anti-British colonialist worldview. They call it the United States. And I have it on good authority that Newt Gingrich agrees with their anti-colonialist worldview also. But apparently Mr. Gingrich supports colonialism and thinks people should be happy to be colonized, but only if it's white people taking over black people's land. Oh, and Gingrich is from Georgia. Big surprise, right? But perhaps the most frightening example of white racist power in the Republican Party was the ascension of Richard Dick Cheney, former Vice President of the United States. In the 1980s, wait for it, as a congressman, the former vice president supported the white South African apartheid regime, actually voting several times to oppose resolutions supporting the release of Nelson Mandela, and called the African National Congress a terrorist organization, as well as voting against a holiday for Dr. Martin Luther King. I bring up Cheney because he still gets standing rounds of ovation from mainstream Republican groups, even so-called non-racist I just vote on budgets Republicans. I am by no means an apologist for the Democratic Party. I support neither political party, but I am not going to delude myself for the benefit of one party either. The only institutionalized racism in Democratic Party officials that Republicans can dig up, they have to go back to the 1960s. You know, those racist Democrats who left the Democratic Party and became the modern Republicans. I've demonstrated to you how you can go to a Republican state and follow the chain of Republicans from the lowest level of the county commission to the state representatives, to the governors, to the U.S. congressmen, to the Republican White House itself over the course of 4 decades. Racism in the Republican Party isn't just a habit, and it's not just a fluke. It's an institutionalized practice and the normal course of doing business. It is condoned and accepted either explicitly or implicitly by everyone in it today. The people who claim to only be in the Republican Party because of budgets or traditional values all quietly sit side by side with the most venomous bigots in politics, the same way the Catholic Church preached the love of Jesus Christ while sitting beside the Nazis. And while you might be able to find one Democrat from the distant past who has a racist record, you can't find a modern example of a lengthy list of Democrats from every level of government defending the Confederate flag, defending apartheid, attacking Dr. King, racially purging state committees, supporting segregation, or merely using the word nigger while the party leadership feigns outrage while laughing it all off afterward. It simply doesn't exist. This racism issue is uniquely a Republican problem, and there's no amount of spin or lying or filmmaking in the world that's going to erase that. When I raised this issue with Mr. Williams, he immediately went on the defensive, and in a sad turn, the first thing he tried to do was deflect attention onto Democrats. Remember how his advice to Republicans was for them to give black people a reason to vote for them? Obviously, he didn't take his own advice to heart because he didn't combat his party's racist record with positive things. And that's the real point. If the Republican Party could just point to something like affirmative action or anti-racial profiling laws, then they would have a leg to stand on. But the fact is they don't have anything that they're able to point to and say, hey, here's the modern Republican Party fighting to remove racism in America today. But you sure can find an encyclopedia of racial offenses. Nothing that they've done or are currently doing is providing any balance against their racist wing. That's when the light bulb goes off and you realize that the reason they can't tell you about their non-racist exploits is because they don't have any. When Mr. Williams challenged me to show him examples of Republican racism, I informed him that the average life expectancy of a human being is only about 70 years, so I would have to make my list brief. I sent him several articles detailing the issues. Since I live in Louisiana, a Republican state, you would think that Mr. Williams would suggest some non-bigoted Republicans I could talk to who would help me see how racially inclusive their party really is. But to the contrary, Mr. Williams' suggestion was that I leave. So his plan to remove the Republican black voter problem is to remove the black voters. And rather than declare his party has a problem and needs to improve, he instead turned into a typical Republican operative right out of right-wing talk radio and tried to change the subject to religion. If we want to make the case that Democrats have a religion problem, then have at it. But the subject is Republicans and racism. Someone didn't tell little Billy that pointing fingers won't get him off the hook. When I would not let Mr. Williams squirm out of it, he fled the conversation. Apparently, he realized why his movie made no impact with either black people or Republicans. When you start off with a lie, you end up with nothing. The simple fact of the matter is that if you removed all the racists from the Republican Party, you would probably be left with the school librarian and the lady who took your tickets at the door. All you really have left in the GOP today are racists and people who don't mind sitting next to racists, which means they might as well be racist too. And being a racist might not be so bad if they weren't trying to run for public office too. But the fact is the Republicans have taught themselves a lie, that they actually represent the real America, and that deep down everyone else in America really does agree with them. So when they try to rewrite history in a white supremacist slant, or they post up their Confederate flags, or they call black people nigger, they really do think that since it's not a big deal to them, that it's no big deal to anyone else. And they've built an entire media structure that spoon feeds them this lie daily. We all remember the scene from Star Trek V where Spock, Kirk, and Dr. McCoy are all sitting in the woods around a campfire singing Row Your Boat. And that is the Republican Party today. A small group of aging old white men who've tucked themselves far away in the woods. They say they want new members, but they won't tell you where in the woods they are. And even if you did find them, they'll tell you that you can't join the group unless you already believe what they believe. That means the only song you can sing is Row Your Boat. I almost wish I had better news for the GOP, but it seems they're quite pleased to continue on their present course to self-destruction. The GOP likes to think of itself as the party of religious people and believers. Belief can be a good thing, but it can also be a threat because belief can make you an ideologue. You start believing things, not because you know, but because it's your habit. And once you become an ideologue, you then believe it's okay to die for what you believe in. And that is where the Republican Party of Believers is today. They've chosen to die for what they believe in. And they're now all sitting around the campfire, reciting what they heard on Rush Limbaugh today, chuckling over Sean Hannity's latest lame joke on Fox News, and blissfully disregarding the latest census reports that show the white population is dipping below 70%. They really do believe they can write enough laws to rig enough elections that they can enslave the non-white population even if they become a numerical minority. If that sounds like Dick Cheney on apartheid, you aren't too far off the mark. To the 2 or 3 non-racist members of the Republican Party who remain, if you really want to save your party from obliteration, you have a monumental task ahead of you. The only real practical suggestion would be to just start a new party because the one you're with is broken beyond all repair. But if you are going to change them, here's the make-believe scenario that would capture you the black vote and actually give your party a shot at survival. Number 1. Admit you are the party of bigots and declare you are going to purge yourself of all racists. Everyone sees what you are, and everyone keeps telling you what your problem is, but you insist on ignoring anyone on the outside who tells you the truth, and you expel anyone on the inside who dares try to correct you. You need an expulsion, like William F. Buckley did to the John Birch Society, only on steroids. Ironically, the John Birch Society is making a comeback in the modern Republican Party, and it's regressions like that which make it laughable for you to claim you're not a party with an affinity for bigotry. Your race problem is the worst kept secret in town. Stop pretending people didn't see Strom Thurmond, or Dick Cheney, or Rush Limbaugh, or Jesse Helms, or Trent Lott, or Bob McDonnell, or Nathan Deal, or Lynn Westmoreland, or the rest of your party that didn't raise holy hell when these people committed the gross acts of racism that they did. You have a half-century of bad blood that you created, and you can't denial yourself out of this. You have to face what you've done and what you are. And the road to redemption runs through the black community that you've brutalized. Senator John McCain of Arizona took the first brave steps in 2008 by coming to black people and admitting he made a racist maneuver while running for president in 2000. And contrary to what GOP strategists expected, he found a receptive audience in black America to a man looking for contrition. John McCain lost the presidential election, but he regained his soul. And if he had a party courageous enough to follow his footsteps during the non-presidential election years, their efforts would pay off in dividends when it was time to select a new candidate, instead of desperately clinging to hopes that there's yet one more presidential election that can be won by fanning the pathetic embers of the ashes of the Southern strategy. And the fact that Mr. Williams had to admonish his own party not to keep trying the Southern strategy is proof that even he knows they have a racism problem, and yet is too afraid to confront it. Rule number 2. The punishment for violating rule number 1. Zero tolerance for racists. If anyone even speaks in a way that could be construed as racist, he is to be summarily run out of the party, and his ouster must take place quickly and publicly. The party has to speak in a single unified voice that it is no longer a safe haven for bigots or even those who are able to tolerate bigots. After World War II, Nuremberg instituted a Nazi hunter group whose job it was to scour the globe to track down and remove any remaining Nazis. The Republicans now need a similar movement in their own party. Any person who claims to be a Republican cannot harbor even the slightest amount of racial animosity. That means no racial slurs, no claiming they were just using terms from their childhood, no code words, no backhanded slights, no undercover movements, nothing. If any man, woman, or machine says a single word against black people or could even be taken as offensive to black people, the party must descend and publicly strip them of their party membership. And do not let undercover bigots try to intimidate you into thinking this is overreaching by saying, well, that's just political correctness. You can't forbid people from offending others. The GOP has been the most heinously politically incorrect institution in America since St. Augustine's slave market. You need to re-earn the right to be offensive. Rule number 3. Come to black people to talk on our terms about our issues. Do not attempt to tell us what should be important to us. You don't try to tell Christians if religion should be important to them. You don't try to tell Jews if Israel should be important to them. You don't try to tell corporations if business should be important to them. Don't try to tell us that we just don't see the right side of police brutality or disenfranchisement. Republicans never try to tell businesses that they just think taxes are too high. Don't insult us by saying we just think we see racism. If it's real to us and you want to represent us, then it better be real to you. In other words, we expect you to treat us just like any other constituency. The voter is the customer, and the customer is always right. Rule number 4, we can spot a token black from a mile away. He usually starts the sentence off with something like, I've never met a racist person in the Republican Party. Meanwhile, he's the only black face in the entire convention. He's their black friend. Republicans always cherry-pick one black person to ferry around as their mascot. He's the only black person they can all stand long enough to sit next to him for more than 5 minutes. He doesn't have any black support. All his supporters are old Republican white men. He strictly stays away from discussing black issues, and of course, racism is a figment of the imagination for this faux black person. Black people see this kind of imposter for what they are every time, but the Republicans are so blinded by racism that they keep trying this knee-jerk reaction after every election, and it always has the same miserable results. The reason they keep doing it is because of what I said before. They think everyone is just like them. So since Republicans vote along racial lines, they just figure everyone else votes the same way. So they really do believe all they have to do is find a black cardboard cutout and black people will totally disregard the party's horrendous record on race and just vote for the black guy. Even though they have Michael Steele and Alan Keyes and practically every other black Republican who's tried to run in a black district. The reason black voters don't vote Republican, even when the candidate is black, isn't because we've always voted Democrat. It's because we recognize that when you want to sell someone down the river, the oldest ploy is to send one of their own people to do it. You'll have to try harder if you want to get us with that one. Might I suggest a biracial candidate whose wife can dance the Dougie? Rule number 5. Give black people something to vote for. Republicans know what the hot button issues are for black people. There are even issues that the Democrats are ignoring that Republicans could steal from the Democrats and enact some groundbreaking legislation that would storm the doors for Republicans in returning black attention to the Republican Party as a viable alternative. For the last 5 decades, Republicans have supported every racist law humanly imaginable this side of Doc Owl. So if you wanted to gain black support, you could start by dealing with those. Democrats haven't moved on police brutality and racial profiling. Make it a jailable federal offense for any police officer who engages in racial profiling or any district attorney who prosecutes a case in a racial manner. The only DA I've ever seen be prosecuted was Mike Nifong, and that was only because the defendants he wrongfully prosecuted were 3 white males who had been accused of raping a black woman. The Republicans made short work of him. Why don't you provide some legislation to go clean up the absolute cesspool of racial persecution that is the Texas penal system? Could you imagine any Democrat trying to stand in the way of that legislation? Nope. In fact, the only people stopping that legislation right now are the Republicans. Because we all know the Republicans don't see the prison system wrongfully prosecuting black men as a problem. They see it as the system working exactly the way it's supposed to. These are the basics of what the Republican Party could do if it wanted to fix its racism problem. But that's not going to happen. Because if you remove the race from Republican, you would end up with mass suicides. The foundation of the modern Republican Party is racism, cloaked beneath a facade of fiscal conservatism and family values. But black people are not fooled. For the white people listening, there's a saying in the black community: game recognizes game. And as long as the Republican Party and its apparatchiks and right-wing media, or would-be revisionists like Kevin Williams, continue to pretend that the Republican Party can ignore its racism problem and get the support of black people, of any non-white people for that matter, you're just all whistling past the political graveyard. The prophets have spoken to you, and you are refusing to listen at your own peril. But don't believe me. Hear them for yourself and see if Mr. Williams makes more sense or if they do. I leave you with 2 clips from Republican strategist Mike Murphy. The first is him speaking in 2010 after the election of Barack Obama. The second is him again in 2012 after Obama defeated Mitt Romney. And see if he's right.
Go out and it's all right. It's a constructive discussion, but at the end of the day, here's the one statistic we all got to remember. The country's changing. Ronald Reagan won in 1980 with 51% of the vote. We all worship Ronald Reagan. But if that election had been held with the current demographics of America today, Ronald Reagan would have gotten 47% of the vote. The math is changing. Anglo votes 74% now, not 89%. And if we don't modernize conservatism, we're going to have a party of 25% of the vote going to Limbaugh rallies, join every applause line, ripping the furniture up. We're going to be in permanent minority status. This is an existential crisis for the Republican Party, and we have to have a brutal discussion about it. We alienate young voters because of gay marriage. We have a policy problem. We alienate Latinos, the fastest growing voter group in the country, because of our fetish on so-called amnesty when we should be for a path to immigration. And we've lost our connection to middle-class economics. We also have an operative class, unfortunately, a lot of which is incompetent. We don't know how to win. So this isn't about new software in the basement of the RNC. It's not about a few Spanish language radio ads. It's a fundamental rethink that begins with policy, because the country's changing, and if we don't modernize conservatism, we can go extinct. The numbers are the numbers.